Good morning, everyone. Ian and I will be presenting a set of slides here that we've put together to help explain what the new approach is to adult equivalence or animal equivalent ratings. The set of slides outlines the application of the major findings of a project that we were involved with, conducted by Stu McLennan, Ian and myself. It was funded by Meat and Livestock Australia, but because Ian and I and Stu have a passion for this area, we've actually put a lot of our own time into both the report, to things like this presentation, the slide show that you're about to see, and some of the other things that have happened in the background. The slides are provided mainly for extension staff to help explain the derivation and application of the findings for practical use in Northern Australia, the findings from the project that we conducted over the last 3 years. So the application of this is mainly for Northern Australia, but it also has national application, and that is an important factor in the approach that we've taken. So the report itself has a range of things in it, but it starts with a comprehensive literature review of the animal unit equivalence concept and the failings of the current system for practical use. It has explanations of findings from trials showing intakes of cattle on tropical pastures were less than predicted by the commonly used Australian feeding standards equations, and how this led to the modification of those equations to better reflect intakes of cattle on tropical pastures. It shows how the AE has been redefined. It has an explanation of a system of using an intake constant with AE ratings to derive intakes of cattle grazing on pastures, and one that can be used nationally, and the application of the new AE system. So as an outline of the way we'll be presenting these slides, first of all, we'll look at the adult equivalent system and what it does. Then we'll have a look at some of the issues with the approach we've used in the past. We'll look at an improved approach that we've developed as a result of our project, and look at the different levels of application of that work from the project. And I'll also give you a bit of an idea of how we intend to update the EDGE materials. When we do get to the updating of those materials, we'll be asking people in the department, lead deliverers, for their views and contributions as to how that should happen as well. So, kicking it off, the adult equivalent system. It's a way of comparing animals of different weight classes and species for many purposes, which I'll go through in a minute, but particularly for predicting feed consumption. It brings all those different sizes of animals, their classes and species, back to a common denominator, or it forms a common currency so that we can compare apples with apples. It's used for describing the grazing pressure that we impose on pastures by grazing animals. We use it particularly for forage budgeting and long-term carrying capacities of properties, and that's something that we'll go through as we go through these slides. We use it for economic comparisons, not only for enterprises, but for properties and across whole businesses as well. And there are those who use it for property valuations as well. I know any of you who've had experience with buying properties or selling, or speak to the real estate agent about carrying capacity of a particular property, they'll say, yeah, that property will run 10,000 a head. 10,000 a head of what? We needed to bring it back to a common currency, because there's a big difference between 10,000 breeders and 10,000 weaners. But the consequences of getting it wrong, getting the adult equivalent rating wrong, can be catastrophic. If you end up putting too many cattle on paddocks, they're overgrazed. The consequences of that can be declining land condition and even permanent consequences if soil is lost and the productivity of that paddock is lost forever, or reduced, I should say, forever. Another consequence of overgrazing is poor diet quality by the stock grazing in that paddock, and that can result in poor reproduction rates, animals not meeting their performance targets, and of course, an outcome of that is poor business performance. If you buy a property and you have a carrying capacity assessment done on it, and it's an estimation of that carrying capacity assessment, you end up with a higher carrying capacity expectation than can be sustained in the long run. So the adult equivalent system has been around for quite some time, and it's always been evolving. Back in the first days of the system, live weight was used to determine the adult equivalent. More recently, no, it was probably in the 1980s, metabolic weight was used to determine the rating for an adult equivalent. More recently, we've gone to using energy as the way of determining or calculating the rating for an adult equivalent. This project that we've done and the application is just another step in the evolution of the adult equivalent rating system. And it's not we're not throwing out what we've done in the past, we're actually building on it to take steps into the future to make it a better system and more accurate. And I asked a couple of lady friends of mine to help me put this slide together. They shall remain nameless, but Jill and Jenny thought this was a funny slide. I didn't think it was funny. Did you, Ian?
I can see the appropriate.
Okay. So going back to comparing the two approaches that we've had in the past, the previous approach to the adult equivalent system was we had a standard animal. The standard animal, the adult equivalent, was a 450 kilogram steer or dry cow at maintenance. And the way we worked out the adult equivalent rating was to use the metabolic weight formula, and you can see it there. It's the live weight of the animal in question in kilos to the power of 0.75 divided by the live weight of the standard animal, the adult equivalent, which is 450 kilos to the power of 0.75. That gave us an AE rating of roughly between 0.5 and about 1.5. And then to work out how much cattle ate in a paddock, we used an intake constant. We multiplied that intake constant by the AE rating to give their intake in a paddock. The intake constant that we've been using in grazing land management, in grazing fundamentals, in nutrition, in edge materials, has been 10 kilograms. So an adult equivalent has been assumed to consume 3,650 kilos over a year for our long-term carrying capacities. With the new approach, we've redefined the adult equivalent as a 450 kilogram dry animal still. So it's still the same animal, but now we're accounting for weight gain, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later. And we're also accounting for energy used in walking. So with the new approach, we're actually now using energy, the relative energy requirements of the different animals to get a handle on their adult equivalent rating. So the formula is the energy requirement of the animal in question divided by the animal energy requirement of the adult equivalent, or the standard animal, which is the 450 kilo animal. But still, we plan to use an intake constant by the AE rating to work out how much cattle are eating in a paddock, or animals eating from that paddock. That's the simple approach that we can take. And that's the preferred approach to use in our edge materials. So we'll talk a little more on that later on. So I just wanted to address some of the issues with the previous approach, the one we've been using in the edge materials for the last 20 years. As I mentioned a moment ago, we have an intake constant of 10 kilograms of dry matter per AE per day. Now, that was what we assumed was the intake of an adult equivalent. Really, when you reflect on it, that's an overestimate for an animal at maintenance. It's 2.2% of live weight, and you'd expect there to be live weight gain at that level of intake. The point about it, though, was it was a safe level of intake, so that when we were doing forage budgets and long-term carrying capacities, we weren't overestimating what that paddock might carry. There's a formula below, point 2. The intake of the animal equals the AE rating by the intake constant. And using the system that we had, it overestimated at low growth rates and underestimated at high growth rates. As I mentioned before, this system didn't cater for walking, and we'll hear a little bit more about that later, but the walking component can constitute 15 to 20% and up to 30% of the energy demand of an animal in the paddock while they're grazing. The other issue that we found was that the Australian feeding standards that are commonly used underpredict weight gain of cattle fed tropical pastures. There were a series of pen feeding experiments conducted by Stu McLennan and Dennis Poppy, and they were conducted at Bryan Pastures, that showed those formulae from the Australian feeding standards didn't cater well for cattle grazing tropical pastures. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later on. The approach that we had been using also didn't cater for weight gain. It was a static approach. It used an average weight in the metabolic weight formula. So there's an example in that table that shows you a steer going into a paddock at 350 kilos and coming out 12 months later at 450 kilos has a weight gain of 100 kilos, but its average weight is 400 kilos. So the AE rating using the metabolic formula was 0.92. Now, if we go to the steer on the line below, if he goes into a different paddock at 300 kilos and comes out at 500 kilos, his weight gains 200 kilos, but his average is still 400 kilos under the old system. And his previous AE rating was 0.92. The new AE ratings cater for that weight gain. And as you can see, the first steer has a rating of 1.05 and the second steer a rating of 1.44. And this helps us to now compute the more accurately the intake those cattle would have on pastures while grazing. And just stepping back and having a look through history, in 2013, Stu McLennan published a lot of that research of those pen feeding experiments that he and Dennis had conducted on cattle being fed tropical pastures, and he found that the Australian feeding standards overestimated intakes on tropical pastures at the same digestibilities and weight gains by 18%. So that's a significant difference, and we've catered for that with this new methodology. Also, it's been known beforehand that a literature review by Ian found that activity or walking accounts for about 15 to 20% of the total energy demands of animals grazing on pasture. In 2014, Ian and Shane Blakely went to the system of using the relative energy requirements of cattle to develop adult equivalent tables, and those tables catered for growth and for walking. Their intention was to use this in business-related studies, so they wanted to use adult equivalents to compare enterprises, properties, businesses, and so forth. And the intention wasn't to look at intake, but a default intake that came from that was the adult equivalent consumed 9.4 kilograms of dry matter per day. And when we tried to apply that in forage budgets in particular, it was an overestimation of the intake, and it didn't work too well in forage budgets. So our recent report, headed by Stu McLennan with Ian and myself as part of it, went through and did a comprehensive literature review. And that review showed that the best way to compare animals and to come up with an adult equivalent rating was to use the relative energy requirements of different animals. Now, Stu then adjusted his model, which is called quick intake, and it has the Australian feeding standards equations in that model. And he adjusted those equations to better reflect the intakes of cattle grazing on tropical pastures. And so now we have adult equivalent ratings that cater for those cattle on tropical pastures. And that was a big step forward for us. But the issue that arose out of that was that only cattle were fed tropical pastures in that trial work. No goats or no sheep were fed pastures, and the differences between the feeding standards effect on intakes and the tropical pastures intakes was ever measured. So that causes a bit of an issue. Now, Ian was able to overcome that by testing whether using the old feeding standards to develop adult equivalent ratings multiplied by an intake constant would come up with a similar answer for intakes of cattle on pasture to the model that Stu developed, which was adjusted for tropical pastures. So Ian used data from the publication by Stephen Bray and Leonie Walsh, published in 2015, that had thousands of cattle. He compared the intakes of using the modified equations developed by Stu with the AE ratings from the McLean and Blakely publication multiplied by an intake constant. So from that, it was an AE rating multiplied by 8 kilograms was the figure that we used. And that comparison gave a very good fit, and we'll show you that later on. It gave an R squared of 0.95, which in biological terms is a really good fit. So that worked very well. We'll talk about that a little more later on. So the new approach is able to cater for a whole range of things that the system that we've used in the past hasn't been able to. It's able to cater for growth, reproduction and activity so that it better reflects the relative energy demands of animals under grazing situations. It gives us a much more accurate intake for cattle on tropical pastures, and it allows for the consistent calculation and expression of animal units for different uses and for different species. So to take you through some more detail now, I'm going to hand over to Ian.
Thanks, Col, and good morning, everyone. So the definition of an AE, or the method of calculating an AE, is now the ME requirements of either the animal or animals in question relative to the ME requirement of the standard animal. And the standard animal, as detailed there, is a 2.25-year-old Boss-Taurus steer, not gaining weight, and walking 7 kilometres a day, which we found is what cattle generally walk across the board. And that's that using the Australian feeding standards, or the nutrient requirements of domesticated ruminants, published in 2007. That comes up with 73 megajoules. But as Col highlighted, those equations underpredict performance or overpredict intake for cattle on tropical pastures, and that's where Stu McLennan's work was able to adjust those equations to come up with a better fit to better match predicted and observed intake on tropical pastures. The outcome of that was now we have 2 sets of equations: the original NRDR, or feeding standards equations, and then a set of modified equations which Stu adjusted to better match predicted and observed intake for cattle on tropical pastures. But what we've found, and I'll go through this a bit more, is that if we use the same equations for either the calculation down the bottom there, the ME requirement of animal in question and ME requirement of the standard animal, if we use the same equations, either original or modified, the result is immaterially different. It's very close, which I'll show on the next slide. And that means they can be used side by side. And the important part of that is the feeding standards are the compilation of empirical evidence to date from Australia, from the US and England. All the pen trials and observations have been done and compiled into that. We found it was not perfect for the north, but it was adjusted. But if we went purely with the modified equations, we'd end up, we couldn't accommodate sheep in there, and they're obviously important in Queensland still, and all goats or camels or others. We also couldn't compare with Southern Australia. And what was quite important to us putting this together was to have a national system where it could be applied consistently nationally across species, and being able to use the 2 sets of equations interchangeably allows us to do that. Now, Col mentioned before the Bray data. So this was a very almost essential bit of a report that we used, where Stephen Bray, Dione Walsh and others that are probably online did the desktop compilation of known growth path data across Queensland and the Northern Territory. And what that gives is actual production data, including pasture quality, for all of Queensland, or compiled by all of Queensland LNT. So that gives us some good actual representative data that we're able to use to test these equations against, and just say, okay, how different are the results from doing that? And what we've got here is 4 sets of results. Now, this is graphed using the growth path of steers in the high productivity regions of Queensland, so Darling Downs, Brigalow area. And we've said, using the different approaches, what AE ratings do result from that. So firstly, following that evolution that Col went through before, the yellow dotted line there, that's just based simply on a percentage of body weight. What's the animal in question divided by 450 kilos? That gives the AE, which is there then the metabolic weight, and we can see there, because of the powder 0.75, that is a bit different to the live weight, based on live weight, and that's there. And then we've got the metabolisable energy demand, or the relative energy demand, in the brown relative to the standard animal, and Stu's modified equation. So a couple of important points there. We can see there's quite a big difference between the energy derived ones and the weight derived ones. And as Col said before, the intake of 2.2% per AE was probably an overestimation. So what happened in reality for forage budgets was there is an underestimation of AE countered somewhat by an overestimation of intake, so that the results weren't too far out. And where the challenge came with the work that Shane Blakely and I did 5 years ago with more representative AE ratings, applying that intake of 9.4 led to sort of showed up that overestimation. But two wrongs don't make a right with the old approach. So that's why with Stu's work, we're able to go through and correct the intake estimation, and it's always going to be an estimation, but correct the intake estimation so that we can apply the AEs to intake and have a relatively a better approach to match the two. Another important point there, I made the point on the last slide that either set of equations we used, either the full feeding standards or the ones modified by Stu, produced a similar result. And that shows that there, where the difference between the blue and the brown line is pretty minor, particularly compared to how it was done in the past. So that gives us confidence that we can use either approach, but the default is the full feeding standards. So as I said, it can be compared to other species and other regions and isn't limited to just cattle in Northern Australia. And for those, the updated quick intake will be based on the blue ones effectively and the AE table on the brown ones. So there's very little difference between them. The quick intake was simply the feeding standards of formulas applied, and they'll be the adjusted ones from now. And for users wanting to get to users that have good diet quality information, that want to accurately predict animals in, say, a research situation, would be best using quick intake. But for forage budgets, the applying of an intake constant per AE will be sufficient. So this again, the Bray data was quite useful in this. We've got two sets of data here. On the x-axis, we've taken the Bray data with the production and growth path of the animals, including weight gain, reproduction for females, lactation, etc. Taken that data for the animals and applied it to the modified equation. So effectively using the what will be the new quick intake formulas off the x-axis. And then on the y-axis, we use the unmodified equations, or the full feeding standards equations, to calculate the AE rating of those animals, and then applied a fixed intake constant of 8 kilograms of dry matter per AE per day to them. And as we can see there, they sit pretty well along the line. That's the R squared of 0.95 Col mentioned earlier. So that was a pretty good match by taking the two different approaches directly to intake through the modified equations, or calculating AE and applying an intake constant from the original equations. The next step of that was to look at varying the intake constant rather than leaving it fixed at 8 and applying 7.5 to 8.5. So the default is 8 kilos to account for the different diet quality or pasture quality on average over the year across the north, and as you all know, there's a fair variation there. We found if we applied 8.5 kilos a day in the low productivity areas, where, and we define low as those regions where steers gain less than 110 kilos a year, if we applied 8.5 there, and then through for the moderate applied 8 kilos for the highly productive areas where they gained more than 150 kilos, if we applied 7.5, they're nearly all exactly on the line. So using the either method to get there to arrive at an intake estimate was the same. So that gives us confidence in this overall approach. This is a point of confusion, and it does take a bit to get the head around where we're saying that AEs on better quality pasture eat less, but the key thing there is it's what dry matter is required to get a given amount of energy. And animals on poorer quality pasture need to consume more kilos of that pasture to get a given amount of energy, and animals on better quality pasture need to consume less per AE to get the same amount of energy. But the per head, and we'll cover this a bit more, the per head, the animals on the better quality pasture will eat more overall, and that'll be reflected in their better productivity, but it's just per AE, so it's how much dry matter is required for a given amount of energy. That is an important concept to wrap your head around in terms of understanding that. And this is, it's as simple as complex as we want it to be. There are varying levels of approaches, and we try very hard to accommodate that. We know not everyone has good weights on cattle to be able to apply. So what we did were there's different varying levels of approaches. We're able to use the Bray data again to come up with some generic tables, which I'll show. So if someone, for instance, says, well, I'm not exactly sure the growth path of my herd for a breeding herd, we can just say, okay, what's the live weight gain of your steers in the 12 months after weaning, and apply that, or we can use a geographic default, which we'll cover in a second as well, and that just gives generic tables. Say, okay, your steers 1 to 2 year old are this, your breeders are that. We'll show that on the next slide. For those that want to look at it in more detail, let's say they've got a mob of animals that I've put in the paddock for a short time, or they know their weights, then there are tables there that can be used, which we'll show, and also some calculators. So more advanced ones, level 3 there, we can go to the quick intake or tools we've developed to look at that. So people that don't have weights, that just want a broad brush figure, we've been able to come up with ones that are pretty applicable. But the more detail people want to get into, and the more they want to refine the accuracy of the results, the approach we've taken accommodates that. So this shows those generic generic AE ratings, sorry, by those productivity zones. High, moderate and low, based on the annual live weight gain of steers. So we've got females there, what the AE rating of each of them are. The asterisk has just dropped off the page. What that refers to is that the calf is included to weaning. So obviously all the pregnancy and lactation is included there, but what the calf forages for him or herself until weaning is included with the breeder count there. So the AE ratings there, and then steers from weaning to 1, 1 to 2, 2 to 3, 3 to 4. And then bulls, and then the intake constant to be applied per AE there. So this is the base level. If you just want to say, okay, let's base the breeding herd ratings off what your annual live weight steers are, here we are. We don't need to match weight to weight gain if you don't want to, just apply this. And these are the broad zones we've applied using the GLM data. But these are broad, and these are almost the default, or these will be the default that will be applied in things like stock take. But there will be areas within there. Col gives the example of the alpha region in the moderate area. But if they're on brigalow country there, then they will achieve more than 150 kilos. So properties can apply the one most applicable to them. But this is what we've been able to come up with for broad regional application. And an important point there, it is a property level classification. We don't look to say that this is a low productivity paddock and this is a high productivity paddock. We do it on a property as a whole to derive what should be applied there. And the next level of application is the tables, and these haven't changed, they've been tweaked in terms of presentation but the results of them haven't changed to what was released 5 years ago in the work then. So this just says, okay, for animals on the top left one, a given level of their live weight and production, this is their AE rating, and for bulls there's a percentage to add there. For the one on the top right, it's breeding females based on their weight and weaning percentage, so that's the average for the mob. So it averages out for those that are reproducing and those that aren't to give a rating there on an annualised basis. And then the bottom table shows the female through through pregnancy and lactation in terms of what her AE rating is, but and this will be straightforward to all of you, but we make clear to producers is that we can't apply the intake constant, say, to those that are in peak lactation, because they physically won't be able to eat enough. That's where some fat comes off their back, and we want to match that with the growing season, but it does show the relative energy demand over that period. And then to get more advanced, this is a herd-based tool we've put together, which uses that Bray-derived data again as the default. So this is the high productivity region. This says, okay, this is the growth path for the high productivity region. And if a user wants to adjust that for their own circumstances, in orange there, they can. And there's some graphs and those tabs along the bottom to sense check that, and some more detail there. But the information put in there, if there's nothing in the orange, it defaults to the what's in the green there. That'll produce AE rating for the whole herd. And then there's other tools as well, but and then the next step would be quick intake. If you've got a good estimate of digestibility, you can use quick intake to get to an intake figure that way as well. So yeah, where we've got to is a national system, so can apply for sheep, cattle, goats, and we're also looking to include kangaroos. You're drawing on some work that Lester Paul has done on a national basis, which we think is important to be able to look at different production systems, different businesses, and have a common currency, as Col said before, to be able to compare them on, which means you're all talking like for like, which is important. So I'll hand over to Col now to talk about the updating of the edge materials.
So yes, it has begun. With the edge materials, we're going to develop a sheet basically and a description and definition of the AE with those simple adult equivalent tables to drop into the text of all the packages. And that's going to happen over the next few months. This is the same table that Ian showed you before. That will be the table in the main text for cattle. We plan to also have a similar table that caters for sheep, larger sheep, merinos and goats, large and small, and of course other animals as well. And we're going to take some of the outcomes of the research, literature review research done by Lester Paul, and just adjust the adult equivalent rating of roos. But I think that's it right there, 0.066 for each roo. So they're the tables that we plan to have in the notes, in the body of the notes themselves, but in the appendices, we're going to have tables like this, the crossbred tables, adult equivalent tables that Ian mentioned a moment ago. So for those who do have accurate figures or figures on the live weights of their animals and the weight gains of those animals, then they can use a much better adult equivalent rating figure, a more accurate one. Multiply that by an intake constant to give an intake of cattle in the paddock. And we can use this sort of material in long-term carrying capacities for properties as well as forage budgets. So there are other things to be updated in the Edge materials, particularly in nutrition. There's a big set of metabolisable energy requirements tables there to be updated, so they're current for the recalculated equations adapted for tropical pastures, and the protein requirements tables will be updated as well. And we're going to have updated forage budgets and long-term carrying capacity calculators to help as well. So I'll just run you through a couple of those. The forage budget will look pretty much the same. The input section here for the paddock area and the pasture yield won't change at all. What will change is up in the top cell here, you either manually select, or in the spreadsheet, you can select from a drop-down list as to what production region you're actually in, the high, moderate or low. So that part of the spreadsheet will be the same, but in the demand side, it's going to change a little bit. So now you can either put in, look up the adult equivalent tables and put in an adult equivalent rating that now accounts for weight gain and walking. It calculates an average daily gain from the figures that you put in up here, and automatically puts in, according to the production zone, the dry matter intake into that cell. So we don't have to worry about working out what level of intake. In the past, we've put in intakes as a proportion of body weight, and it's always been a bit of a guess, but that's taken out of it now. Sorry, yeah, that's what this shows, that in the past, we've had to estimate what the intake is as a proportion of body weight to get a good dry matter intake. So that's been taken out of that forage budget. No need to estimate anymore. And the results section looks exactly the same as it has in the past. So not too much has changed, but the functionality of it will be much better. With the long-term carrying capacities, and these are the simple spreadsheets I developed for GLM, instead of having an annual intake of 3,650 kilograms per adult equivalent, it's now 2,920, using 8 kilos per day. But you can vary that according to your production region, and you can actually, if you're in the low productivity region, then your intake's going to be 8.5 kilos per day and a little over 3,000 kilos per year. So that's the main difference here. The point is, when you may come up with a different adult equivalent rating for your property here, but when you go to convert those numbers back to animals in the paddock, so many breeders or so many growing animals, that's where it will cut them back, because the adult equivalent ratings are much higher and cater for growth and walking. So that's the end of the presentation. I just wanted to summarise here. The standard animal from our work is a 2¼ year-old, 450 kilogram Bos Taurus steer with 0 weight change, walking 7 kilometres per day. So now we're catering for weight change and walking. The Australian feeding standards do not predict the intakes of ruminants on tropical forages very well, but we can use the adult equivalent ratings that come from either the modified or unmodified equations to derive an AE rating to use to multiply by an intake constant to get the feed intakes of cattle in the paddock, and either of those techniques will be applicable and give accurate information. So again, the intake of cattle can be estimated
One thing to add on that, Col, this can raise the question, as Col just said, if the change of the AE and the intake ends up with a similar result to the forage budget, say, well, what's the point of it? But that is two wrongs making a right. If we think back to that example we went through with an animal gaining either 100 or 200 kilos having an AE rating, if we're going to do any serious economic or business or enterprise analysis on performance per AE, it's nonsense for those two animals to have the same AE rating. So we need to be able to accommodate that to be able to do sensible analysis, and also comparing with sheep and also roos and others in the literature, the divisor for AE to DSE range from 5 to 15 and wasn't nailed down. Now, for this application, we're confident that it's 8.4, so it clarifies that. So sort of tidies it up across applications and then takes that error out of it, even though the two errors count each other somewhat for forage budget applications.